Well, welcome to week one, lecture two. See, in the previous lecture, we spoke about the chasm that we feel exists and that's been sort of fixed before us, even before we enter into the conversation regarding cross cultural ministry and engagement. We spoke about the hegemony of much of white Western thought, philosophy, and cultural imperialism in the world. And we spoke about the ways in which our entrance into engagement is made difficult because of a set of dynamics that it preempts our arrival. And in the third lecture, I'm going to talk about some of the dynamics necessary for us to navigate that chasm that exists before us. But and then next week we're going to talk about how this problem isn't just simply innate to the United States, but also finds its way into other cultures in different ways as well. And in the end of the lecture, I stated that we need to be aware of cross-cultural engagement because it's no longer an option for us. And I want to use an example for this. So as I wrote this lecture, I was sitting in a coffee shop in Peoria, Illinois. And sitting in that coffee shop in the city center, you become very, very aware of the inescapability of cross-cultural engagement. Peoria has regularly been rated as one of the top 20 worst cities for African Americans lived in the United States due to education and earning potential, along with several other factors. But also as home to Caterpillar, this multinational corporation that makes large construction equipment, but also being the home of two of Illinois' teaching hospitals. It draws a lot from a lot of different cultures around the world, and it finds itself is within the top 10 of per capita Muslim communities within the United States. Now, that's per capita, not by population, right? So it's got a thriving mosque that sits within our community. And in this favorite coffee shop of mine, you regularly see the socioeconomic disparities, as well as men and women who are dressed to the nines, who are coming from the hospitals that are right across the street, are crossing the paths of the significant homeless population there in Peoria, those that meander about from the Rescue Mission to the Salvation Army to the Dream Center. And on top of this, Peoria sits across the river from Pekin, which is where I currently pastor, and that is a town with a deep-seated history of racism. We are 98.7% white, and those from Pekin think that Peoria is a foreign land, and those from Peoria think twice about visiting Pekin. In one mid-sized community surrounded by a bunch of multiple little communities, we find cultural dynamics that shape our interactions with one another and influences the way in which we engage in ministry. Currently, we have a young man who grew up in the Chicago suburbs, who came and stayed with us here in Bridgeway at Pekin for a church plant residency program we have for 1 year. And we're sending him into the heart of Peoria, where he and his wife, they are both white. They're going to be planting a church in an underserved area that is primarily Latino and African American. Now, just because he's planting a church in the United States of America doesn't mean that he shares the culture of the community in which he is landing. He is very much standing on the forefront for us of cross-cultural ministry engagement. You'll have a chance to hear from him throughout this course about some of the lessons that he's learning in that process. He's got to be very aware of cross-cultural interpretation. So it's inescapable. It's there. We find it in our cities and in our communities all around us. But secondly, I'm currently working on that book, The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman, for supplemental reading for this particular course. And he contends that in this book that given the technological revolutions worldwide, that the access to internet has bridged this geographic space. The cross-cultural dynamics are always at work within our lives. We call a bank in the United States, and we end up speaking with a customer care representative in India. And though it's noon our time, it's late into the night their time, which means they have created entire communities in India for those who work in the customer service world so that their life rhythms can mimic the rhythms of those who are paying the bills on the other side of the world, which I just find to be incredibly fascinating. Many of our men and women that find themselves in our congregations work for multinational corporations. Some of them travel regularly throughout the world, or they keep offices at home because they work for a company based in Germany, but whose field office is in London and their design team is in India. And that shapes the horizon of the imagination of many of our people. And likewise, for the church, technology has made it possible for us to have a greater sense of global issues and how those global issues affect us. And how they ultimately impact our understanding of the gospel. We're given through social media access and opportunities to witness the work of God throughout the globe. And we're seeing this amazing explosion and expansion of the gospel in the 2/3 of the world that was once thought to be undeveloped and unrefined by our once hegemonic assumptions. However, and one of the things we need to be understanding of is that this expansion in the 2/3 world has forced the American church, which for the most part is deeply stagnant, to turn to the Eastern world for instruction and guidance in the ways that their practices should shape our practice. Now think about this. Instead of the American church now any longer feeling as though we are the subject matter experts, we are now the learners, which means we're learning how to be cross-culturally engaged so that those with whom we are engaged, not to seek to convert them to our ideas, but to learn from them and appropriate their lessons within our diverse and rapidly changing cultures here in the United States, which is unbelievably fascinating. And to this, I want to add a third dimension, and it's globally that one that is probably more contentious for reasons that make this cross-cultural dynamic that we're talking about even more necessary. It's the rapid movement and of the global refugee crisis and conversations surrounding the growth of immigration and the desire of so many people to escape the brutality, the poverty, and the violence of global areas in search of a brighter and better future. This global event has produced a conversation, sometimes helpful and sometimes, let's be honest with ourselves, oftentimes destructive and divisive. An awareness of the complex layers that are involved in this argument are becoming deeply important for us to understand as we, as practitioners of the faith, have to navigate this global refugee crisis and the rapid growth of immigration, especially as it relates to the kingdom of God and then to our people's perceptions, ideas, and their oftentimes constrained imaginations. Xenophobia is real, and at times it's really scary. Fear of the other often drives us to lash out loudly. It's the fear of difference, the fear of encroachment, the fear of culture wars. It's the fear in which the dominant culture faces when it feels as though its culture is being threatened by the other, right? And it's changing what it believes to be the only or best kind of culture, and the only way of really being in this world. So when immigrants come, the dominant culture lashes back or wrestles with xenophobia because it doesn't want to be changed by what it believes to be a diminished or less than kind of culture. I would suggest that the explosion of Western populism is the last gasping breath of modernity that we spoke about yesterday in our previous lecture. It's a feeling that change is inevitable, but through resistance, the populists feel as though they can stave off that change, stave off globalization through tactics of fear and stereotyping or Armageddon scenarios. And I do want to note this, that conservative evangelical voices will often turn to apocalyptic literature in the Bible, poorly exegetically using it to support their own fears. But the refugee crisis isn't going away anytime soon, no matter one's desire to build walls. This crisis, one that reaches not only into cities like New York or Nashville, but ones that find their ways into the heart of American Central in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, or Fargo, North Dakota, and other cities that have maintained a hospitable approach to immigrants and refugees. It means that as a pastor and as a minister in those areas, in those cities, in those regions, that we have to be cognizant, aware of the ways in which we enter into relationships with the other and how our relationships are already being shaped by cultural dynamics and factors. The other is no longer found simply in remote villages in Africa. The other is here. And given the decline of Christianity in many areas of the states, and as Christians, our minority status in the cities in which we live, we got to remember that sometimes we're the other to a dominant secular culture, and they're having to learn how to interpret us now as a result of the changing dynamics in the United States. So the next question we want to ask going into the third lecture for this week and the final lecture for this week is, how do we begin to navigate this terrain that lays ahead of us? And we'll talk about that in our third lecture.